What Your Bank Doesn't Tell You, a podcast by UMushroom.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our new podcast series. Today, we are going to talk about the real estate and consumer confidence crisis in China. For those of you who follow the news, you've probably read that Evergrande, one of the largest developers of real estate in China, who actually declared default in 2021, is currently in extensive talks about restructuring of the debt, and it's a little bit like the last chance. They have a period of a little bit more than a month until end of January 2024, and this is like literally the last chance that they get a turnaround. Otherwise, this large real estate developer, the largest in China, is facing actually a total liquidation. And we are going to follow up with you today. What does that mean for the Chinese economy, and what does that mean mainly for our economy here and for the world?
Thank you, Luba, and also hello from my side. You might wonder why we picked that topic and why we consider it as relevant. And to explain that, we would like to put some numbers into perspectives. As you might guess, China is a very important market. They represent about 30% of the global GDP. As well, China is a big consumer, so they are consuming almost 15% of the global consumption. To put that into perspective, the US, they are even a bigger consumption, even though the population is smaller than China. But the Americans, they consume a bit more than 20% of the global consumption. But still, China with close to 15% is a considerable number. And then Luba spoke about Evergrande, the real estate developer who is in trouble. And this company has debt outstanding of over $330 billion US. About 1/10 of it is offshore, is held offshore, so it's in the global financial markets. The rest is held onshore. But it's a huge amount of debt this company is holding. And also to put that into perspective, for example, Nestle, a global company as well, they have about 50 billion Swiss franc of debt, and Amazon, an even more global company, they have 140 billion of debt. And taking a Chinese example, Alibaba, for example, they have just 25 billion of debt. And you can see Evergrande, they are playing in a completely different league with 330 billion of debt. And Evergrande is just one company out of the various real estate developers in China. And this is the reason why we truly believe that this is a topic we would like to cover and also to shed a bit more light on.
And given the numbers which you heard from Tonya, we asked ourselves, are we actually at the verge of a new subprime crisis? We've seen some of those developments in 2006, 7, 8, and they're surprisingly shocking parallels. For those of you who remember, actually, 2008, this was a classical mortgage credit crisis. This was the key driver. A lot of loans were given by banks to private individuals to buy houses. Typically, a bank would finance not only 100%, which is extreme, of the purchase price, but even they would give a top-up for renewing the house. So they would end up financing 110, 120% in extreme cases of the value of a new home in order to stimulate consumer or individuals to actually buy new homes. Needless to say, if you don't do proper due diligence to see if those people can pay one day the houses, if they're properly used, if there is a real case behind that, or if they're rented, and if there is some kind of a security that interest rates on the loans are going to be paid, default and a huge, avalanche of defaults actually was the consequence. It's very similar in China, by the way. The leverage comes a little bit different structured, but nonetheless, it's a highly leveraged economy. And we were surprised to discover that over the past 10 years, the individual leverage or indebtedness of people has doubled. And it's pretty much actually up to 64% of what it used to be from compared to for 10 years ago. So household debt as a percentage of the GDP of China has doubled in the last 10 years, and it's in the meantime 64%, which is actually huge given the amount which you mentioned, given the size of the Chinese economy. What does that mean? Currently, how do Chinese actually buy houses? They would put a down payment, and the rest would be taken by the developer of the respective real estate right on credit. The down payment, or the initial investment for the property to be built, must not necessarily be paid by own equity, right? You can also go to the bank and get a loan. So you end up actually having almost 100% leverage of a particular property, which is not even existing yet, which is in process to be built. And you need only little shaking in the general economic level to start seeing a level of defaults. Not to mention cases like Evergrande, which actually are highly over-leveraged. And it's kind of a spiral. The more they get leveraged, the more they start building. They don't finish houses. What happens with the individuals who are buying these houses, they assume and they know that they're not going to see their houses, so they actually stop paying their debt to the banks and start defaulting on any kind of credit. Currently, by the way, in China, there are above 8 million of the young population who are in default, who are bankrupt actually, and they're blacklisted by their authorities. This is 1% of the working population of China. And if you're blacklisted in China, it's quite a classical process as we would see it in a lot of economies. You have it. You're actually sued by your creditors. You have certain period of time where you need to pay back your loan, and if you don't, then you're blacklisted. And if you're blacklisted, you don't have access to payment facilities through apps. You and the family cannot get a job by the government. You can't use toll roads. And. It has a huge consequence.
Yeah, basically cut off of life if you want so.
Correct.
And also listening to you the involvement of the financial industry is tremendous, because they are involved in giving loans to the developers themselves, but they are also involved in financing the down payment, as you mentioned before. So the involvement of the financial industry and the impact on the financial industry is just huge. But we would also like to explain, how did China actually end up there? Because they come out of communism, and in communism there was nothing public, right? All the properties, they didn't belong to the individuals. It was a government market, and this held on until into the 70s. And only after the 70s, after Mao period, they experimented with various ways of how to structure the real estate market, because in communism also some of the demand and supply, or the market, was not always very efficient. So at the beginning,
it's basically staying governed. I can relate to that a lot. It's like
so there are different parties involved which participated. One party were the provinces, because they could sell land to the developers. So for them it was a mean of generating returns, given most of the taxes paid by individuals ended up with the main government in Beijing. Then for individuals, also investing into real estate was a very big thing, because in China the financial markets, they were not that developed, and real estate was basically one of the very few things they could invest their money. And of course, then there are the developers. For them it was a very good business as well. And Luba mentioned before how it works. They get the down payment, they get the loans from the financial industry, and they can start building. And given everybody had an interest in this market, it was very easy that it grew over time, and that we somehow ended up in this bubble as we have it right now.
It is absolutely the case, and what is very dangerous is the fact that in parallel to this development, where you have on one side a highly over-leveraged real estate sector, and you mentioned, I believe, that it's roughly 30%, right, of the GDP. Imagine what an exposure. The government is also, the state is also actually contributing a lot to that, or has been, until they realized it's actually very dangerous, this kind of a down spiral which is triggered. But at the same time, on the personal consumer level, you see a huge unemployment, 21%. You see 8 million defaulting, 1% actually are in default. You see consumer confidence fading away in the largest economy or the second largest economy of the world. And those are very, very severe dynamics, or dangerous dynamics, putting the second largest economy in a severe situation. And the spillover effects are huge.
True, and the slowdown of the economy also then had again an impact on the real estate market, because especially in 2020, I mean, we had the pandemic, there were general economic difficulties or slowdown in China, what you explained just right now. And then also one very important thing, the current government under Xi Jinping, he implemented new rules when it comes to taking debt for the real estate companies. So all these factors together caused a tremendous slowdown in the system, and suddenly there was much more supply of apartments or houses in comparison to the demand. And just to name a few figures, so in the year 2020, the real estate market slowed down by 2%. In 21, it was already by 11%. And last year, in 22, it was almost 40%, the slowdown. And this year, in summer, it peaked again. And this is one of the reasons why also so many real estate companies, you mentioned the biggest one, Evergrande, got into real trouble.
Yes, and you mentioned the amount of, when we were preparing, there was a very interesting number. You mentioned this was the amount of empty flats in China.
It's enormous. It's 80 million empty flats are currently in China. Or flats, not just empty, but not finished by.
This is scary. This is basically Germany, like a flat per German citizen.
Even more, if you consider that more than one person lives in a flat.
Absolutely. We also asked ourselves what is the impact actually globally, and which are the industries which are most impacted. And you probably would not be surprised to hear that pretty much every industry is very impacted by what's happening or will be in the next years. A very natural one is obviously the constructors and the producers of building materials. But another industry which is really severely suffering is also telecommunications and semiconductors. And an interesting fact, for example, among the top 10, probably the company with the highest exposure in terms of revenues in the USA to China is actually Qualcomm. And the next ones are semiconductor producers. So it's pretty much really telecommunication services providers and semiconductor producers. In Europe, you have luxury goods, car makers, and obviously not to forget the asset management industry. And there are a lot of providers of asset management services, for example, Aberdeen, UBS, the BlackRocks of this world as well, Schroders, even a smaller company here, who actually have funds who invest indirectly in China. And yeah.
True, and this is in equities, but also in debt, and also in the real estate debt of Evergrande. We mentioned before that they have $30 billion international debt or offshore debt. And this debt, we couldn't get the exact figures, who is holding the 30 billion, but we get a glimpse that most of these obligations are held by asset managers and, in a sense, indirectly by the public in this sense. And it's very interesting to see that the West and the rest of the world is impacted by various factors out of this real estate crisis in China. It's the equities, it's the debt, it's the economic slowdown, I believe, most importantly, who will have a big impact on the global economy, or could have a big impact on the global economy.
Definitely. And to that point, Europe, for example, and currently there is a committee from the European Union actually in China to discuss the huge trade deficit, which actually Europe has toward China, because Europe's raising the point that the Chinese government is actually supporting with more leverage, already over-leveraged manufacturing from China, and those manufacturers are actually targeting Europe. And some of the industries most hurt by such type of behavior are actually the car producers, particularly the e-vehicles. Europe is relatively liberal when it comes to importing e-vehicles from China, as opposed to the USA, who I think have 25% importing tariffs, and same with India, or similar with India and Turkey. And Europe's basically the next large market, which is pretty much open for Chinese producers. And you see there's going to be a huge global disbalance impacting our economy here in Europe, impacting the US economy, and impacting a lot of industries, impacting individual companies. We also had a look, speaking to you about individual companies, we had a look which are the highest exposure of which Swiss companies have the highest exposure in terms of revenues to China. And to my big surprise, this was actually among the highest is actually Swatch with 33%.
Very interesting. But also the point you were mentioning that basically the world is importing from China. And this is one of the reasons when, during the financial crisis back in 2008-9, when the consumption or the imports of other countries from Chinese goods were declining, that it was actually also an incentive even for the Chinese government to boost the real estate market, because for them this was a way to compensate the lacking revenues from the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And now somehow they need to get out of it, no?
Now they're doing the other way around. They're like boosting the manufacturing to get out of the real estate travel they're into. It's very fair to say that if Evergrande, I call them, by the way, Evergreen, because it's like an evergreen story how crises start, always with real estate debt.
True.
And with mortgage.
True. Real estate credit, and it goes into the rest, yeah.
Absolutely. So if they don't manage to turn around, and there are very loud voices that it's pretty impossible to get a turnaround right in January 2024 unless they don't get bailed out and good knows how, we are going to see, we believe it's very possible to see a more serious crisis which is spilling over Europe and the US.
And listening and reading the various analysts covering China, most of them, they mention that they assume it's a longer term recovery or fixing of this real estate market because of this huge oversupply.
It's a structural issue, right?
It is. And somehow this oversupply needs to be eaten up by the demand, and this can't happen overnight. I mean, we mentioned before there are 80 million outstanding apartments or unfinished apartments, and it just takes time to get into an efficient equilibrium again. And in addition to that, also the Chinese markets, they might need to be a bit more daring in letting the markets play so that the prices really can adjust. This hasn't happened freely over the past few months, and this would help definitely as well to stabilize it, but also with the risk of exploding. So it's a very thin line they have to navigate to really make sure or to prevent that the bubble is bursting with all the negative impacts.
Absolutely. And on that note, I believe we mentioned all the points which we wanted to. We would be very happy to hear our opinion about what's going to happen and what are the major risks, but also chances. Who are the countries which may profit most? Who are the industry which may profit most? Write us. We are happy to discuss it then in a follow-up podcast. And for feedback, ideas, remarks, questions, always happy to read from you at hello@umushroom.com.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Money! What Your Bank Doesn't Tell You, a podcast by UMushroom.